So just generally, hello folks. My name's Chris. As we talked about, I'm a solution architect here at Sanity. I've been a big fan of Astro for quite some time, so I was really stoked to get to dive into this and show you folks a little bit more about how it works and how it works with Sanity. Um, I believe you should be seeing my screen now. Hopefully it's not incredibly dark like it kind of looks on this display. I'm hoping we're okay there. Let me know if it is crazy dark. I'll try to figure out what's going on there. But we basically are going to look at today Astro and Sanity. Thank you, Knut. I'm going to kind of assume that you folks maybe aren't coming to this with a ton of Astro knowledge, maybe just a little bit and a little bit of curiosity. So I'll cover a little bit about what Astro is about. And then I'll cover how Sanity and Astro integrate together. I kind of assumed if you're here, you know a little bit about Sanity already. So I'll skip going too deep on Sanity, but we'll talk about why I think Astro is cool and how our integration works with Astro to give you some really cool kind of like a developer experience bonuses. Also want to call out, I'll share the link to these slides after the fact, but this is all based on a guide on our website. So any information we cover today, you'll be able to see it kind of fully documented in a process so you can recreate what you see today on your own local machines. So to dive into a little bit about Astro and why I think it's pretty awesome. Astro, as you might already be aware, is what I've seen referred to as a meta framework out on the internet, right? Similar to like Next or Remix or Nuxt. Basically a tool set that took a popular UI library like Next did with React or Nuxt did with Vue and added tooling around it to make it more powerful, add extra features for developers to build sites and apps with. So Astro is the same thing. It's a toolkit for building sites and apps. You might be able to hear my dog freaking out there. Apologies for that. But Astro also has a kind of unique story in that even though, Next took React as a foundation for itself, Nuxt took Vue as a foundation, Astro actually developed their own UI library, their own templating language for use within their framework. So they kind of have a slightly different story there, right? It's not based on an existing framework. They have their own setup. Astro is also, I think, very unique in the fact that you can actually bring any of those existing UI frameworks into Astro and use it alongside those Astro templates, right? So in a second, I'm going to show you what an Astro component looks like and give you kind of a rundown of how they work. But if you look at that and you say, I'm good, I've learned enough UI frameworks for one lifetime, you can actually import React, import Vue, import Solid, use those inside your Astro app, just like you would inside of another framework. And funny enough, you can also combine those, right? So if you have a React library you like and a Vue library you like, you can use both inside an Astro app, which I haven't seen in any other frameworks, which is kind of cool. So Astro is a meta framework, right? It's a toolkit for us to build powerful apps and experiences for our users, but they also have their own UI templating library. So to take a look at what an Astro component looks like, I'll jump over here. So there's, in my mind, kind of two or three main parts here, right? This is on our right-hand side, an example.astro file. All of the Astro templates have this .astro extension to them. To start off at the top is what's referred to as their code fence. And this code fence is basically serves two purposes. One, it's a place you can initialize your component. By that, I mean you can import other components that are going to be used, or you can read, the props past your component or other things exposed by Astro, like the route you're on or whatever it may be. But this code fence also serves the purpose of essentially signaling to you as a developer, here is logic that is only going to be run on the server, right? So you can do things like fetch data here. You can read sensitive environment variables. If it's inside this fence, you're essentially telling Astro, keep this only on the server. Don't run it outside on my client, and don't send any of this information to the client. So kind of just a powerful little piece of kit there that goes under the radar. This is a way to block everything inside the server. When talking about the actual templating and how you turn your code into markup with Astro, it's actually very similar to JSX. If you're used to using JSX, it just has a couple quirks to it, if you will. One, it seems like everything about Astro's, school of thought for how they want you to be building web apps and thinking about Astro components is, for lack of a better phrase, getting back to fundamentals, right? So thinking in terms of vanilla HTML, vanilla JavaScript, vanilla CSS. Um, and so inside of an Astro template, you can pass any valid HTML will work as part of an Astro template, right? There's no consideration like with JSX of, okay, I need to take class and turn it into class name. I need to take my ARIA attributes and rename them to camel case. Um, Anything that's valid HTML can get brought into an Astro template and live inside of that Astro template and work just like you'd expect. But they also included some really nice, perks of JSX, if you will. For example, you can bring in other components, right? So you can see that we can include our Astro component we imported in the last step. We can read props and pass props to our markup. Like you saw, we read our what prop, and we can pass that to any part of our markup. We can also do other JSX-like things, like looping through maps or mapping through an array of whatever it might be, being able to create lists or several components in a row. You can check for values to be nullish. It's very, very similar to JSX. There's just kind of a few variations in terms of how things are named and how you do things like comments. And I included a link to that here if you're curious to dive into what the real differences are there. But ultimately, it's meant to say, think of this like HTML, just with all the perks you've kind of come to love about JSX, and you're off to the races, so to speak. So that's the templating part of it. You also have the ability to include a style tag. So these styles will be scoped to the component you are using. So anything you write inside the style tag will only apply to this component. You can make them global if you like, but you also can just have this scoped as needed and write your styles in line with your component, just like you would with like a view single file component type of approach. And then finally, we have script tags, right? So like I said, we have that code fence at the top for server-side logic and server-side scripting. The script tag inside of your Astro components is basically your way to do behavior on the client, right? So this could be classic vanilla, document.get element by ID to get access to our H1 heading here and do something to it. You also have access to all the typical browser and window APIs, and Astro is kind of encouraging you to think and write code in that spec, in that world, right? Kind of going back to basics. When I started with Astro, something I really liked is that it felt a lot more like writing just standard vanilla HTML JavaScript. And so every component can have a script tag, and you can do that type of logic, do that type of scripting directly inside that script tag. Also worth mentioning too that Astro is going to be bundling and optimizing these scripts and styles for you. You can turn that off if you want, but all these will get nicely bundled up and split out when a user requests your page. So only the JavaScript that's needed is going to the client, and nothing that doesn't need to be there is loaded unnecessarily. So when you put it all together, that is what an Astro component looks like, right? Essentially a fence for our server-side stuff, our template for our markup, and then we have the ability to style and do client-side scripting as needed on the bottom side there. In terms of Astro, the framework, not just these Astro components, I would think it's honestly very similar in terms of functionality and developer experience to what you might be used to with maybe a more well-known or established framework, right? So there are certain things I think you kind of expect from those types of frameworks, right? The ability to have a performant optimized way to fetch data, a way to set up, routing, not only basic routing, but kind of more advanced nested routes and layouts, the ability to have serverless functions and a serverless runtime live alongside your app, the ability to traverse rendering methods from fully static on the server at build time to fully client side at runtime. You can go between that entire spectrum of SSR, SSG, CSR, and then also kind of just built-in helpers that you're used to with a framework, right? So there are some built-in shared components for things like linking and images. There's also these global state or global helpers that you can access inside of your Astro templates for things like your routing, where you currently are in a path, the props for certain components, whatever it might be. They kind of try to give you all the same toolkit that you're used to from those types of frameworks. But then Astro also specifically has some of their own unique features that I haven't seen pop up in other frameworks that I'm aware of. I could be wrong. Please let me know. Specifically, they have a database that you can spin up and seed data with and live inside of your Astro components That's specific to the framework, right? You can, inside of any Astro component, query that database inside of that code fence and get access to the database, what the data that's stored there, right from your Astro templates. The same is true for content collections. So inside of your Astro sites, you can have a folder named content, and Astro will scan through every file you have in there, whether it's Markdown or JSON or CSV, and it will add those files to your local memory. And you can also query them inside your Astro templates, right? So you can have Markdown that lives in your file system or a JSON object from a legacy project. You can pull that in and query it inside of your templates or your pages, as well as any other data you might be fetching from the CMS. As we mentioned, Astro components exist, right? You have the ability to write this kind of more HTML, JavaScript-y type of syntax right then and there. They have a CLI that's very powerful for adding integrations. They don't really ask you to actually install the dependencies yourself and update the configuration yourself. You can run this CLI command and they will install dependencies and update configuration files for you, which is really powerful and kind of a big time saver in my mind. And then finally, as we mentioned, you can combine all the different front-end frameworks you might be used to using. Basically either choose your favorite or bring in multiple different frameworks to use as needed inside of an Astro component. And one other thing I'm realizing here that I haven't actually touched on just yet too is that there's top level await inside of every Astro component, which is kind of goes under the radar, but I think is really powerful when we're thinking about where other frameworks are in terms of catching up to that type of behavior. Inside a page layout or inside any of your individual components, you can fetch data from an API or from a database or a content collection, which is really, I think, a super powerful paradigm that we're just starting to kind of see take more of a hold over how dev tooling works. So worth calling out in terms of Astro components. You can fetch data anywhere inside of them, which is really, really nice. And finally, if I haven't drilled this further enough, I think the final thing that really sold me on Astro when I was checking it out for the first time years ago is that it's very performant. It's a very performance-minded framework, right? So by default, it's not shipping JS to the client. If you don't write anything inside of your script tags, you don't use React or Vue inside of it, Astro will attempt to ship 0 JavaScript to the client if it's not needed. They also default to SSG. So by default, they'll render your pages statically as HTML at build time. And then if you decide I need it to be rendered on demand, they're still kind of always pushing you towards rendering on the server where it's going to be a little bit more performant before going fully client side. You can still run that spectrum, right? You can still render fully client side. You could put an SPA inside of Astro if you want to. But ultimately, they're going to try to gently push you back towards the server where you can render things a little bit more quickly and more performantly without sending all that JavaScript to the client. So one of the many reasons it sold me on making the jump over to Astro. So when talking about Sanity at Astro specifically, there's kind of two halves to this. There's our specific integration, the Sanity Astro integration. There's also a couple community tools I'll touch on at the end here, but our integration brings essentially 3 really powerful pieces of functionality to the table in terms of your Astro app. One, that embedded studio I mentioned, and I'll dive into here in a second. You can basically have a Sanity Studio that mounts and lives inside of your Astro app, all right? So you don't have to have 2 repositories or 2 directories inside your code base. You have a Sanity Studio that lives right then and there inside of your front end. Funny enough, as I mentioned, you can run React inside of Astro. That's exactly how this works because the Studio is a React app. You can load the Studio as a React app on a route inside of your Astro app. You get a built-in client, so similar to how Astro's database and content collections work, where you can query data directly from that code fence. The client shows up in there as well, and you can now query data from Sanity alongside all the other places you might be getting data from. And then finally, we include a toolkit for making visual editing a little bit easier for folks who are maybe handing the CMS off to content editors who want to be able to see their changes live. Traditionally, that's been tricky with statically rendered sites, but our toolkit makes it nice and easy for folks to make changes, see those changes live, and get those updates immediately without having to guess or wait for a build to finish to get that information showing on their screens. And then finally, there's 2 other pieces of tooling I'll touch on for handling portable text for block content. and for handling images inside of Astro with Sanity as the CDN. But one, as I mentioned, Astro has a super duper handy CLI where you can run npx astro add for whatever integration you're adding, right? So you can run npx astro add Sanity Astro, and then, as I mentioned, Astro React, because the Studio is a React application. Astro will automatically add the Sanity configuration and the React configuration to your astro.config file. For those not aware, every Astro project has a .config file where you kind of tell it what integrations you're using, how your app's going to run. And so when you run this command, basically automatically you'll get these added to your Studio, or your Astro configuration file. And then basically you specified this Studio base path, and that tells Astro everything under /studio is going to be a Sanity Studio, and that's where you'll find this React app for managing your content, right? So if I actually jump over to my own site, I have an example site called Albie Thoughts. This is where my dog posts all his most controversial musings on the world. And this is a Astro site through and through, right? /post / the slug for the post is where he posts all of his insane ramblings. But on localhost 4321 /studio, we get the Sanity Studio just like you're used to, right? No second repo, no second terminal running with this code base. Just I started my local dev server. I've got, my standard front end as well as my Studio up, running, ready to go. No extra work on my part there. So super duper powerful. I think a very clean mental model for developers. And if you're someone, like I said, coming from Astro's collections or Astro's databases where all that stuff lives inside your repo anyway, this feels like a very nice natural extension of that mental model in my mind. So when you install the integration, you get immediate access to that. Nothing special about it. You just add that Studio base path and it shows up there at /studio. You also get a built-in pre-configured client. So the ID and the data set and the general settings for the API you specified inside of your Astro config file, right? These project ID, dataset, CDN. When you pass those to the configuration file, that powers a pre-configured Sanity client, right? So inside of here, we have essentially a Sanity client ready to go, looking at that data set and project. And then inside any Astro component, you can fetch, Sanity client.fetch. Inside there is a grok query for our specific post. And you can pass that as props to your template beneath it and be off to the races, so to speak. So very handy, very similar to what you might be used to with Astro's developer experience, but now just for fetching data from the Sanity client. Also worth mentioning too that the Sanity client not only fetches data, but you can use it to write information back to Sanity too. Kind of a sneaky little superpower there. So if you ever were looking to do more dynamic content management from an Astro interface, you could theoretically do that. Just want to call that out. You don't have to just use .fetch, but we expose basically a built-in client for you to use throughout your Astro components and import just like this. And then the final piece there, outside of the community options, is visual editing with presentation, right? So about little under a year ago now, we launched what we refer to as our presentation tool, which is kind of a revamped way to think about visual editing inside of your Studio. And so if I jump over to my Studio, you can see we've got all of our blog posts. If I click into one, you'll notice we have the ability to see where it's used. And if I click into that, we can see the front end, our Astro front end on the left-hand side, and we can see our editor on the right-hand side. You'll notice that these blue boxes pop up right on every piece of text or editable content inside of the Studio, inside of my front end. And as I click on those, I get brought to exactly where they live inside of the Studio. So content authors now can essentially look at just the front end. They can click into exactly where they want to make edits. Sanity's going to bring them right there. And then as we make edits to this content, Sanity is saving it and then updating our front end in real time. So we can know exactly what the site's going to look like as these things come through, as these changes happen. And so that is exposed via our integration, right? If you look here at my code base now, this is that app for Albie Thoughts. Inside of our layouts, we're including our visual editing component, which is imported from the Astro integration. and realize, sorry, that might be slightly small on your screen. So I'm just going to zoom out a little bit there. Basically, you provide this visual editing. There are a couple options you have to pass to your pre-configured client that we showed you there to say, basically, am I looking at drafts or am I looking at published content? And to let it know that it should be working in this visual editing mode. And that's all outlined in that blog post I specified that I'll share at the end of my chat here, where essentially you import that component, you pass some options to your client, and you have the ability to get that live preview experience for your authors, where in production, this will just fetch data statically render your pages on the server. But then when in this presentation mode, you get this live as you type update for your content and are able to see things immediately as they go. And then finally, the kind of two last pieces here I wanted to call out were there are also some community tools for managing, some of the more specific things about Sanity. So for example, portable text, block content that we saw from Sam's presentation. There is a package for this called Astro Portable Text. Super handy, allows you to get all the benefits of portable text just inside of an Astro runtime. And then there's also an image library called Unpick Astro that not only returns an Astro component for your images, but it also picks up on the fact that you're using Sanity CDN and is able to automatically provide source sets for those images right then and there inside of your Astro components. So I just want to call those two out as being super beneficial and kind of a nice little sprinkling on top of the integration that we provide for you. But that is basically it. That is how you go ahead and set up a Astro site backed by Sanity.